right, and welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm your host, Courtenay, and I'm super passionate about moving and thinking. On this show, we are going to dive into all things health, fitness, personal development, lifestyle, and political sociocultural. I've always been fascinated by people, and I love learning from the experiences and stories of others. This has been a treat for me, and I hope this is enjoyable and useful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or any way that I can make this a better experience for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hello, welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm here today with David Pyne. He is the Deputy Director of National Operations of the EMP Task Force of Homeland Security. How are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. So for people who might not be that familiar with what you do and what that is, could you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, you bet. So I joined the EMP Task Force on National Homeland Security back in 2018 as a state director here in Utah. And then I got subsequently got promoted to Deputy Director of National Operations at the national level. That was just a couple years ago. And what we do, so the EMP Task Force on National Homeland Security is we're a congressionally authorized board that was created kind of to continue the work of the Congressional EMP Commission. For your listeners, EMP refers to electromagnetic pulse. And what that is it is an effect that's both naturally occurring from the sun, from super solar storms, as well as, which happen, we're talking about, mega, essentially we call super geomagnetic storms, can have an EMP effect that can be as great as worldwide as it was in the Carrington storm of 1859. But kind of on a more immediate threat is the threat we have from Russia, China, and North Korea that have super EMP weapons, which are nuclear weapons that are especially enhanced to have a more profound EMP effect. So what EMP can do, electromagnetic pulse, can take out, we call it kind of a technology destroying weapon, right? Because it can, take away computers, internet, electronics. It can
everything we're dependent on today.
Everything we use, critical infrastructure, all the stuff that we've enjoyed since, the early 1900s. So it's a real profound threat and danger that a lot of Americans aren't very aware of. And our mission is to try to, educate both our policymakers. And, I've met with a number of members of Congress to try to, I can't say lobby because we're not lobbyists, but to incentivize them, to act to protect the American people against this deadly threat that threatens to starve tens of millions of Americans in the event that it occurs. Wow.
So what are some of the things some measures that you take to incentivize them, and what are some things that you advise that can be done to protect us?
So what we typically do is we have a subject matter expert. We have here in Utah, we have a former U.S. Air Force major who served as a nuclear war planner. And he provides a briefing to members of Congress and their senior staff members to kind of outline the threat. What is EMP? How could it affect us?
Right.
What are the dangers? What are the threats? What would the potential losses be in the event of either a kind of a regional or a nationwide EMP event, either man-made or as I mentioned, a super geomagnetic storm from the sun, as well as, I guess I'm kind of more in charge of the solutions, right? In terms of,
hear about the solutions.
Legislation that we're pushing both at the state and federal level. Our state director here in Utah is more focused at the state level and more focused at the national level and those types of efforts. And just so you listeners know, I've been writing a series of articles in the national interest at www.nationalinterest.org, kind of outlining what we need to do to ensure peace with Russia throughout this Ukraine crisis. And we can talk about that in the next segment. But also on our main website is www.emptaskforce.us. And that's where I have one of our latest task force reports that I published back in October that's available to your listeners. We also have our executive director, Dr. Peter Pry, has published a number of books. He's much more prolific than I am, articles that are very educational and very important for both your listeners and American citizens at large, as well as our U.S. leaders to read as well.
Awesome. Yeah. So maybe you can start with talking about what are some of the solutions you think that are available.
So President Trump he's been their best president so far in terms of solutions. He signed an executive order that was designed to try to increase measures to prepare for EMP event and to increase our resiliency of our critical infrastructure against those types of events and attacks.
Right.
But principally at this point, what's missing is the actual funding to harden the grid. So when I say harden the grid, I mean, our critical infrastructure, the main element of we believe is the U.S. electrical power grid. That's kind of, it's really the source of so many, things that we need and enjoy, including running water. If we had a net, a lot of people have times when their power gets knocked out, but if it's just a limited power outage, then they still have running water. But in the event of a nationwide, or a large scale takedown of the power grid, they would lose running water. So people can't live without water for more than a few days. So that's a pretty critical need. So that's one of the reasons that we need that, as well as refrigeration. In terms of food distribution centers, even if the cars were knocked out, if they could at least preserve the food and maybe get them to people in a slower way. So that's important as well. But yeah, the main focus that we have is funding. We need government funding, and also legislation to incentivize the power companies to take measures to protect not only against EMP attack and super solar storms, but cyber attack as well. And they're all connected. You can do them all for the same price, essentially.
So can you talk a little bit about how they're connected and what is the danger that we are facing? How precarious is this situation?
So, I'm not really a technical expert, so I'm not going to speak much on the connection between, how hardening it can be done against cyber and EMP at the same time. But in terms of our threat, the threat level has gone way up. We've seen a lot of people would describe the threat level for EMP attack as minimal until recently. Now it's more in the moderate to, I consider it to be in the high range, unfortunately, because of what we have going on with Ukraine. That has really caused me to focus not only on my efforts to try to motivate a change in national security strategy at the national level and to support this kind of important EMP hardening legislation or grid hardening legislation, but also to encourage people to take personal action as well to ensure they have sufficient food, water, and medicine in their own homes.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people are talking about that, and a lot of people are saying how crazy that sounds. And a lot of people just really can't, wrap their heads around it and fathom how in this, modern age that would even be something to contend with. But
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So going further in terms of the Ukraine issue, first of all, we have this major foreign policy schism or debate between, the two sides. One is, I would call them, I guess, Trump conservatives, America First conservatives, folks like Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Paul Gosar in the House, and other, staunch America First conservatives that are saying, and Tucker Carlson on Fox News obviously is one of the best voices for to articulate what an America First national security strategy.
Definitely in the mainstream media, I would say.
Yeah,
for sure.
Very different. Absolutely. So, essentially what I believe it should be is to pursue policies, that serve the American interests. We've been fighting all these wars that, we fighting other countries' wars, essentially getting their civil wars, defending Ukraine's borders, but not our own. We've had 2 million illegal immigrants that have invaded our country. And obviously, I'm not trying to compare the threat of illegal immigrants coming to our country to a Russian invasion. But there are a number of security concerns through that. I mean, I was just watching Fox News today, and they talked about how Russians and Ukrainians were found on the borders. I mean, there have been Chinese nationals crossing the borders among the illegals, and very few of them are from Mexico. Many for Central and Latin America. Obviously much less of a threat, but we've had Islamists come from all across the Middle East that could potentially form terror cells, and there's all kinds of issues like that.
And we should have learned anything from the 90s and the early 2000s. I think that's a good piece of history to revisit.
It is. Yeah. Certainly Reagan's initial amnesty of 3 million illegals back in '86 didn't go quite the way that advocates wanted it to go, or said that it would go. They may have had ulterior motives. But I think it's really important that we ask the question to our elected leaders. What is the security interest that is threatened in Ukraine? I mean, there's literally no vital security interest in Ukraine at all. Certainly, we have a general interest in wanting to ensure that people's remain free of oppression or free of foreign takeover. But that should not be military in cases that are not vital interests of the United States.
Right.
We live in a world. I grew up in a world where there was a rough nuclear parity between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and that enabled us to keep the nuclear peace, along with the Yalta Agreement, which kind of established spheres of influence, on the Soviet side in Eastern Europe and on the U.S. side in Western Europe. But today, that military balance, a nuclear balance, is largely disintegrated. I mean, Russia and China today have over twice as many strategic nuclear weapons as we have. Russia has 4.5 times overall, including theater and tactical nuclear weapons. So, and not one member of Congress on the Republican side is pushing to increase the number of strategic nuclear weapons that we have deployed in response to this massive Russian and especially Chinese nuclear buildup. And so there's just a major, there's a huge amount of ignorance, I think, at the U.S. policymaking level. There's been a dereliction of duty and failing to do anything really to really protect the American people against the EMP threat. Not a lot at the cyber defense level, and very little at the national missile defense level. Reagan supposedly collapsed the Soviet Union with the Strategic Defense Initiative, but that was never even built. So obviously, it's an impossibility that he caused the Soviets to collapse over something that was never built. But the point is, the fact that we don't have it, 40 years later, is a little troubling, because we have very little defense against nuclear missiles.
Yeah, which is really quite horrifying. I think there's a lot that we, in hindsight, learn about, the Cold War that was not quite what was presented to us through our mainstream media. And we were certainly not, we're definitely not as protected as we may have thought we were. And we may not have been there for the same reasons we thought we were.
Right.
So a lot of these things that we don't see until years later. What do you think I'm concerned about, this is in relation to the threats that we're possibly facing and the danger that there is the concern of Americans being dragged in. You were talking about, fighting other people's war. And through NATO, there is the possibility that, we could be dragged into a kinetic kind of a war.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? And what are your thoughts on how much of that is a real threat versus an EMP or cyber type of threat, or both, using one to disarm us so that we're less secure for the other?
Yeah, it's a huge threat. But first, let's look at history. And in terms of entangling alliances, we were warned against entangling alliances by our first president, George Washington.
We were.
And he was our greatest president, I believe, and very visionary. And he saw the danger that, to America's national security, our freedom and our independence and sovereignty, to, joining these European alliances and potentially being dragged into wars that are completely unnecessary and against our national security interests in the first place. And that would certainly be the case with Ukraine. The irony is we don't have any security agreement with Ukraine. Ukraine's not part of NATO. So what's all the fuss about Ukraine is kind of my point, I guess Tucker Carlson's point, and others that are trying to argue in favor of more of a Trump conservative type policy. The former president Donald Trump, he was interviewed by Glenn Beck recently, and he pretty much, he didn't come out, exactly and say it, but he definitely left you with the impression. He said that we shouldn't be in Ukraine. So we shouldn't be involved in Ukraine. And he essentially said that, if he was president, he would ensure peace with Russia. And he's, when conservatives say that, they get accused of, being like kind of not Russian agents, but pro-Russia. But to be in favor of against a war we can't win with the mightiest nuclear superpower in the world is not being pro-Russia, it's being pro-American.
Exactly. And
right.
I think this is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but I think this is a lot of the psychological warfare games that they play, where they try to, what is the connotation of being pro-Russia? It's that, suddenly we're pro-communistic, Bolshevik type initiatives. And, there's been tremendous shifts in Russia, and to support American, as you said, American interests, if it's aligned with, peace with Russia, doesn't necessarily mean that we're suddenly, saying that we're supporting, a global communistic takeover.
Yeah.
That my opinion that it is a part of a, these are the psychological warfare games that they play to try and pit people and create, categories and camps for people to fall into, because people glob onto, identities. And the way
that's absolutely right.
It's a way to corral people to garner the interest and the motivation to, because people need to acquiesce. You need the support in order to engage in the warfare, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's inevitable. In all of history, we've had kind of war propaganda that's pushed by the state or state influence. I would say state controlled media, because thankfully we don't have that like Russia and China have. Right. But state influence.
Pretty close. We've got this.
We do. With the Biden administration, we do it. The Trump administration was kind of like an arm of the Democrat Party. So it was clearly part of the Democrat anti-state opposition. But currently it's just a propaganda arm of the Biden administration, essentially. Yeah. But not only that, if we look at history and, entangling alliances, great power alliances in the are what transformed World War I and II from regional conflicts, in the case of World War I in the Balkans, between Russia and Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Second World War between Germany and Poland, and ultimately between Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union, into world wars. And if there hadn't been these great power alliances, those wars would have remained localized and at least in the case of World War I, a very limited duration, would have been a quick war. Potentially, I mean, it could have definitely expanded to full scale war between Germany and the Central Powers. But in terms of lives lost, the cost would have been so much less, and that's exactly what's threatening us today. President Trump I was reading an article today that talked about, a recent book that based on interviews with senior Trump officials that said that Trump stated multiple times in 2018 and 2020 that he wanted to get us out of NATO, and NATO is really kind of the sacred cow for neoconservatives and liberal internationalists. I call it an unholy alliance between neoconservative Republicans and the liberal and nationalists and Democrat side that are really, kind of the globalists that are trying to get us into these no-win unnecessary wars that, in this case, at least threaten potential, nuclear or EMP war, which could bring the war home to the American people as no war has ever done before. But I think Trump was very visionary in that, U.S. national security would be better protected today outside of NATO. NATO was critical in helping us to, defeat the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. But since then, especially, with certainly in terms of following, the expansion of NATO eastward, that's gotten us into this mess with Russia over Ukraine. Today, it's become what I call kind of a noose around our necks that threatens to sink us down into war.
Yeah. So what are some things that can be done to secure peace with Russia so that we don't get into this very nasty mess?
Yeah. So I've written a number of articles, I think 4 recent ones that address that exactly. And again, you can find them on the nationalinterest.org. And one of the key proposals, or one of the easiest proposals, is simply just to tell Russia that Ukraine will never be admitted to NATO. And some people say, well, that's a huge concession. And certainly we could ask for something in return from Russia for that declaration, but it's really not a concession at all. It's a statement of fact. NATO's requirements for new members into NATO include, having a state having borders that are not disputed, not having any foreign troops occupying their territory, because essentially, if we were to admit Ukraine into NATO today, we would be in an undeclared war with the Russian Federation. So that's not something that would even be considered, is being considered. And Biden reportedly told the president of Ukraine exactly that. And then they, once that story came out in CNN, they immediately tried to deny and refute it. But I believe that story is accurate. France and Germany, Bush and Obama, President George W. Bush and Barack Obama tried to get NATO to admit Ukraine back in the 2008-2009 timeframe, but France and Germany opposed it. So that's kind of the easiest solution is, and it would be even better if the president of Ukraine could make that statement and say, Ukraine is not going to join NATO ever, and we're going to be permanently neutral. And that would take away Russia's biggest pretext for war. But beyond that, they've issued some draft security agreements to the U.S. and NATO, which I believe actually have some beneficial elements to it. And one is that we pull all of our troops out of Eastern Europe. And some people say, well, that's a huge concession. We only have 5,000 U.S. troops in Eastern Europe, so it's not a huge concession. It's something we've only had since 2016. So, all this time from, when NATO was expanded in 1999 to 2016, we had 0 Western troops in Eastern Europe. And no one said, oh, NATO is going to collapse because we don't have any troops in Eastern Europe. But, essentially that's kind of the way they're presenting it. So, those are 2 things we can do to increase peace with Russia. The other thing is to potentially, have reciprocal quid pro quo agreements, so we're not accepting their demands, essentially, their bullying. We're saying, okay, we'll do that. We'll do this element of your proposal in exchange for a reciprocal concession on your end. So I've actually been covered in the international press. I was interviewed on Russian TV just a couple of weeks ago about that. Okay. And yeah, I'm not saying that we surrender. You know, a lot of people say, well, if we accept their agreement, that's surrendering. Well, it's not, because there are very important concessions that we should get in return. And I've described this as a golden opportunity for President Biden to redefine our relationship with Russia on much more friendly terms. You know, they've talked about how China is the number one threat we should be worried about right now. But Russia and China have been close military allies. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't want to mess with.
What is that saying? You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't necessarily I always go for that, because I think it didn't work out for us so well in the World War II with the Soviet Union. I strongly oppose our alliance with the Soviet Union and have been very critical of that back in World War II.
Right. I'm not advocating that we follow that. I think that people should pay more attention to the fact that maybe some of our enemies may not necessarily be friends, but they see us as their enemies, and so they're aligning with each other. Exactly. I think that, you know, so the Middle East should show us something about that.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Our decision to invade Iraq and destroy the balance of power was a huge mistake on the part of George W. Bush. Iraq had actually fought a war against Iranian terror during the 80s and 90s. And, you know, and we opted to destroy them. And Reagan actually said, you know, we won't allow Iraq to be defeated, to lose the war with Iran. So he was a much more far-sighted visionary leader than George W. Bush, certainly. Yeah. But yeah, so.
But they had different interests. That's entirely possible as well. But.
Yeah, well, different interests. That's interesting you bring that up. So there's a new book called Red-Handed by Peter Schweitzer that talks about the communist Chinese business family connections of the Bush family, of the Biden family in particular, Pelosi, Senator McConnell, former Speaker John Boehner. I mean, the corruption at the highest levels of the US government is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the ties that they have that are not aligned with American interests are very, very concerning. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of other things that we can do, so back in 2019, I wrote about the need for the U.S. to sign a sphere of influence agreement with Russia and China. That was basically what Churchill did at the fourth Moscow conference and at Yalta, of course. And I oppose that. You know, let me be clear. I opposed Yalta. I thought it was a bad deal. We shouldn't surrender. You know, as you said, we shouldn't surrender tens of millions, or actually 140 million innocents to, you know, the communists. But we're not dealing with the communists in Russia anymore, right? The communists in collapse, and certainly they have ties to the old Soviet Union, but it's not the genocidal communism that we saw then. That actually is the case in China. And yet, and they went ahead and attacked us with a biological weapon, with COVID-19 that's killed nearly 900 million Americans, or 900,000 Americans, almost a million. And, you know, we're worried about Russia. You know, Russia hasn't really done much against the U.S. Over the past few decades, but China certainly has.
China certainly has, and I would argue the global elite, you know, fascist corporate technocracy has.
Right.
They're certainly in, you know, they're certainly in an alliance with China. So
they are. Yeah, and they likely stole the last presidential election, collusion with the Democrats. Yeah. Or at least the evidence suggests that. And the last thing that I think we need to do is we need to sign a treaty of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with Russia as kind of the capstone of our new relationship that would, I believe, it would essentially neutralize their alliance with China, because what that kind of is it's a political alliance agreement. So if we were allies, even non-military allies with Russia, then they would have, you know, feel more strongly and more secure about their security, and they wouldn't threaten to join China in attacking us or attack us on their own. And then China would be less likely to attack us without Russian backing. And there are other initiatives we could pursue with China, such as signing a non-aggression pact, telling Chinese leaders that we would not intervene militarily in the event of a conflict with Taiwan, which is their number one red line. Just as Russia's number one red line is stay out of Ukraine, and we keep pissing them off. Excuse my language.
Yeah,
picking them off, right? Needlessly, poking the bear is probably a better analogy.
Sure.
So when we're militarily superior, as we were for decades, a few decades after World War II, and we have nuclear superiority for 25 years straight, then you can pursue these policies and not have severe threats or reactions against them. But when you're inferior, when we've lapsed into military and nuclear inferiority against our
military seems to see wokeism as a priority over strengthening our
then it's much more dangerous.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm curious your thoughts on why there isn't more of an initiative and a movement towards some of these protective strategic alliances, and why some of the priorities of our military, are not concerned with actual militaristic strength and more concerned with, some of these woke policies. It doesn't seem to be in the, doing any service to America and the protection of America. So what do you think's behind that? What's the motive there?
Well, I think that, we continue to be propagandized essentially by, the liberal establishment, the media, and the neoconservatives into believing that the U.S. is still the sole surviving superpower. We can do anything we want. We can invade any country in the world and allow ourselves to be invaded by illegal immigrants, and there will be no national security repercussions whatsoever. We can export our best jobs, best military technological industries to China, and trillions of dollars, and they won't use that to build up their military and their nuclear arsenals they have. So it's a real problem.
Naive.
It's absolute naivete, and
not behind the people who are creating this propaganda, but behind the people who are buying into it.
And a lot of Republican leaders think that we can threaten nuclear weapons. Senator Roger Wicker just recently stated on national TV or an interview that we should threaten the use of nuclear weapons against Russia if they dare invade Ukraine, that we have no alliance with. So there's a real dearth of strategic thinking, in terms of how to redefine our security relationship with Russia in a way that's remakes the international order to be much more beneficial, much more safer and secure from a U.S. standpoint. There's a belief that the liberal international order that we have today favors the U.S. And certainly, the U.S. has been able to get away with a lot, in terms of invading Iraq and occupying part of the Middle East and whatnot, and expanding NATO eastward. But every bad policy has a day of reckoning. I'm increasingly fearful the day of reckoning is on our doorstep.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's increasingly approaching and rapidly so, which is quite terrifying.
Yes. So there's, in further answer to your question, there's different schools of thought. There's the dominant school of thought is we should pursue a strategy which we kind of realists call liberal hegemony, and that is this strategy that what I basically described, that we can the U.S. should try to dominate. We should try to defend every country from Russia or China, no matter how small or insignificant, and that we need to to and oppose them at their borders. So it means sending our ships into the Taiwan Strait, to antagonize China. It means, naval exercises in the Black Sea and the Baltic Seas, which are, are mainly kind of Russian spheres of influence, and then, threatening to expand NATO further into the former Soviet Union, Those are all really, really bad policies that, hurt our national security much more than they help. And that's, as I think you kind of suggested earlier, it's kind of what has caused Russia and China to align together in an alliance of convenience. It's a very real military alliance, very close, but it might not exist if I would say it'd be very unlikely to exist if the U.S. had not been pursuing all these provocative policies of confronting Russia and China along their borders. What I've been advocating, and other realist foreign policy experts have been advocating, is a policy of retrenchment, where we define what our vital national security interests are. In my opinion, they should be, the Western Hemisphere, Western Europe, and Japan. And then those would be the areas where we would, threaten a nuclear response, or, kind of pull our military forces back to. And then a lot of the other areas that are more peripheral, we would withdraw our military forces, and that would help strengthen. I think it would go far to strengthen us and deter our enemies from attacking us.
Yeah. What is the likelihood that any of these measures will be taken?
I like to say I'm an optimist. Yeah, as our director Dr. Peter Pry has stated, he's kind of a glass half full kind of guy. I may be in between. I'm not necessarily as pessimistic as he is. I'm certainly as realist as he is. I think the chances are pretty low unless we get a lot of our leaders. I've advocated President Trump to go on a speaking tour. He's clearly stated his position. With Glenn Beck, if he could hold rallies, and criticize the Biden administration for being too provocative to Russia, right. Not concerned enough with China, but really just focus on the need for peace with Russia, the need for us to stay out of Ukraine, to limit, to end NATO expansion, and make a public proclamation of that, and pursue a policy of retrenchment, which would strengthen, our national security much more than the policy we have today. I think that would be really helpful. I think there would be a lot of Republicans in Congress that would kind of reawaken and be like, oh yeah, I guess I believe that as well, instead of parroting the liberal neocon propaganda line that we need to fight a war with Russia and Eastern Europe, right? Or provoke them to attack us.
So how many, like you talk about the Republican congressmen, how many of them do you think really think that is the best strategy? Or do you think that they're somehow being, I don't want to be too forceful when I say coerced, but somehow they're being influenced into that? Or do you think they really are believing that is a best strategic move?
So unfortunately, America First conservatism kind of took the Republican Party by storm. And President Trump did, he made a lot of really commendable efforts to try to, do a lot of things that would help us right now, including pulling out of NATO, that he doesn't get credit for, and he's criticized and attacked for mercilessly.
Sure.
But unfortunately, since he's left, a lot of the ideas that he's championed are kind of being suppressed, I would say, by kind of the old guard Republican leaders that were what I call Bush Republicans.
Sure. Yeah. It's the establishment people. Yeah.
The establishment. Yep.
Yeah.
Like Mitch McConnell and other folks that are, much more hawkish against Russia for no real good reason other than they just want to continue the Cold War.
Yeah.
Without any regard to, trying to break up the alliance between Russia and China, which I identified back in 2000 as the number one national security threat and priority of the 21st century. And I think that's being bared out. We'll see how things go. Hopefully they won't get any worse. But it's a huge concern. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of hope for pursuing, a better grand strategy until we kind of re-educate and kind of recapture the information battle space, essentially, to get the word out.
Yeah, and that is a huge battle for sure, because the conditioning the groundwork for that has been laid for so long. I would argue, that was one of the primary objectives of the Cold War, to be honest.
Interesting.
Yeah, I actually think a lot of the Cold War was, there was so much psychological testing that was done during that time that I feel has really surfaced now. And there was a lot of the propaganda tactics that were used then are being really weaponized in full steam now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know that, everybody at that time was aware that was at play, but right. I think that the powers that be, as I like to call them, certainly had some idea that.
Yeah. Going back to one of your previous questions, I think that one of the biggest obstacles is that we've learned all the wrong lessons from the origins of the Second World War. There's a lot of folks. I heard one congresswoman today talking about how it's 1938 all over again, and this is Munich. This is Munich too. The Munich Agreement, of course, was where British and the French got together with Italy, and they agreed to permit the German annexation of the Sudetenland, which was 95% German. So essentially that was furthering the principle of self-determination, which was one of Woodrow Wilson's most laudable principles in his 14 points that preceded the end of the First World War. In Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, has been villainized wrongly, I would say, because he was absolutely opposed to appeasing the Soviet Union. Britain and France tried to explore a grand alliance that later formed with Churchill at the head of England against Nazi Germany. And the price that Stalin, requested for that alliance was control of all of Eastern Europe. And Chamberlain said he absolutely would not ever agree to allowing or supporting another country to take over another country against the wishes of its own people. And that's something that Churchill did with the Yalta Agreement. Of course, as I mentioned, the Yalta Agreement ended up providing us with over half a century of peace. And so there were good outcomes to a very, what I would say, immoral agreement. But, I think we need to learn from history, and the lessons of history have not been learned. And as Bismarck was once quoted, saying, if he who refuses to learn from the lessons of history is condemned to repeat it.
Yep. Yeah. And I do think there's so many parallels to Germany in 1938. And, even in terms of the recent, the pandemic, and a lot of those measures that were being used, and then war following that, right?
Yeah. But just as kind of a final point, so I believe the lessons we should learn is not that appeasement caused World War II, because actually appeasement, the policy of appeasement or accommodation of Germany didn't cause it. It was the abandonment of the policy of appeasement which caused World War II, when Britain issued its military guarantee of Poland against Nazi Germany. Had we allowed, or had rather the British and the French supported some kind of compromise where Germany got back about a third of its lost territory from Poland, in terms of Danzig. Well, Danzig was never Polish, but at the time, but the Polish quarter, then I think World War II would never have happened. It would have been a war between Germany and the Soviet Union exclusively, and one that could have lasted decades. And I really believe that the best strategy, as Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese military strategist, stated, the best strategy is to win without fighting. And
for sure.
The best way to win without fighting, or rather one of the best ways, I would argue, is to get your enemies to fight each other, kill each other off, or if not, fight each other, to be focused on the threat posed by one another versus any perceived threat that we pose to them.
Well, I would argue that is what our enemies want to do, have us do. But we should learn from that and not engage. Yeah. Yeah,
Yep. Exactly.
that's fascinating. That's a really interesting point about appeasement because that's what you're always taught, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I would also like to add that I think we should probably learn something from Russia because Russia is really taking care of Russia right now.
Yeah. They're making Russia great again, as some people are saying.
Right? Yeah, you're
And
right.
China's doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. We should
Right.
definitely get back to them, make America great again, and America first.
Yeah.
Please, yeah. I want to ask one more thing about how can we, because I really do feel that one of the, all the strategies I think are super important. But I think none of them get implemented or executed without the propaganda that's behind it. You do need
Right.
the will of the people to acquiesce. So I guess I would put to you, what do you think are some of the measures that people, and you can talk about, the entities and the governments as well, but really, I think individuals, how can we combat some of that propaganda? I'd like to empower the people if there is a way.
Well, I mean, yeah, there absolutely is a way, uh, I would say that one of the best ways you can do that is to read some of my articles, my latest articles on the national interest, and kind of, and click on the links. I have a lot of different supporting links. It's not like I'm saying that, just believe me. I have, a couple dozen links in each article probably that link to what other people are saying, more renowned foreign policy and national security experts than I am, that kind of support the same kind of strategy. And so, the key is to first, kind of educate yourself. And then once you're educated, and it doesn't have to be like, a matter of weeks or months or years, you can just read a few key articles and then send those along with Dr. Peter Price, various books and articles that are available on our EMP Task Force website to members of Congress and state legislators as well. I mean, certainly the foreign policy solutions, aren't really worth talking about with state legislative leaders, but in terms of state hardening the grid, legislation, we found that it seems like the chances are far higher to and because state legislators are so much more accessible to the average citizen like ourselves, to start a conversation and try to direct them to our state leaders to help work together to get these kind of solutions implemented in terms of grid hardening legislation that actually fund the hardening of the grid and our other critical infrastructure against EMP and cyber attack. Cyber attack being, of course, the most likely means of warfare that we'll face. That kind of initially, we actually have, according to former Obama Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, he said when he became CI director in 2009, he was told that the U.S. was having 100,000 cyber attacks a day, and that was over a dozen years ago. So we can only imagine how many hundreds of thousands of cyber attacks we may have going on today on a daily basis. But obviously, those are low-level cyber attacks. They're mainly dedicated to maybe installing backdoors and stealing military technology and secrets. But the type of cyber attacks that I'm talking about are ones that are potential existential threats. For example, there are 300 Chinese-built transformers that have been installed during the Obama-Biden years in our electrical power grid, and China, most likely has, we discovered kind of backdoors, malicious software built into those transformers that could potentially be used to shut down the grid just with that threat alone. Let alone, super EMP satellites like the North Koreans have that could potentially shut us down with the press of a button without any warning, and potentially without U.S. leaders even knowing what country attacked us.
Wow, that's horrifying. That's
it
really
is
horrifying.
Yeah.
And even the we'll call them micro attacks, but I mean even those, because as you said, they could be creating backdoors that only lead to easier access for the bigger.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
yeah. Well, Yeah, hopefully we will not have to face that, because what would be, I guess that's what we can close with. What if that does happen? What will that mean, and how can we recover from it?
So, I mean, I've talked to cyber experts, and they've said that China in particular has the ability to, shut down our electrical power grid, our internet, and perhaps even our early warning GPS satellites, potentially indefinitely. They've, really enhanced they're extremely capable from a cyber attack perspective. And then EMP would be even a more dangerous threat. Cyber, of course, can be temporary. You can because what they do is they essentially can they overwhelm our systems with so much data that it can't, they shut down. They can't process it. So, for example, when I'm predicting that if and when Ukraine is invaded by Russia, the first thing they'll do is engage in a cyber attack, to kind of shut down their power and communications and their command and control and their early warning systems. So, they'll essentially be blinded and unable to coordinate the defense of their country against the Russian invasion. But the advantage of that is if they were to occupy it and take it over, they can, as they take over certain areas, they could essentially restore the power and communications in the Russian controlled areas. And then the areas that are outside their control, they could continue to just use cyber attacks to intimidate the population and to, ending their resistance and ensuring their takeover. But with an EMP attack, there's major damage that's done to, computer chips and, electrical transformers and whatnot that would cost hundreds of billions, perhaps even a few trillion to repair. And, we've had kind of situations like Puerto Rico where, the power has been shut off by a hurricane, and they've been without, water purification and, reliable power for over a year. But we had all the resources of the continental United States to help them restore it. Yeah. But if this were to happen to the entire country, there wouldn't be any backup. We have 3%, only 3% of our transformers in reserve. That in other words, if we lost 100% or even 80%, we have 3% to put back, to like restore and replace. That's not nearly enough, and they take transformers take a couple years to build, and there's only a very few number of producers. Mainly we get ours from Germany.
Is there anything that can be done? I mean, obviously we want to prevent getting to that stage where it's better to prevent the crisis than to deal with the recovery of a crisis. I'm wondering if there should be or could be both should and could be measures to strengthen the reserves of transformers and, so that we could recover if such thing were to happen.
Yeah, there's a huge number of measures that we could take that would be very beneficial, that would serve to protect us. Obviously, hardening the grid against cyber and EMP attack should be the number one priority. But that would take at least 2 years to accomplish, and that's assuming it's fully funded, right? Right. If because initially we could start with a $2 billion effort, and then expand it to, some people have said the price would be as high as $30 billion. But if you think about how many trillions the Biden administration has been trying to expend, certainly with the 5 trillion, supposedly 1.75 trillion, but it's actually 5 trillion, quote unquote, build back better socialist takeover plan.
Right.
30 billion is a small drop in the bucket. It's like less than 1,000th of what that spending would be. And so we can easily afford, and even if we took it out of our defense budget, I would be more than happy. I would
argue that is defense, isn't that?
Yeah, right, exactly. I would be more than happy to reduce funding on our conventional military in order to build these strategic defense systems that are so much more critical. We could have a conventional military 10 times bigger than all of our enemies combined, and it wouldn't matter at all if they could take us down with a cyber EMP attack and, cause our government to collapse in our society.
For sure. And I would argue that we could take some of the money that's currently being spent on diversity training in our military.
Yeah,
right. Some of those programs can be defunded in favor of, protecting our, cyber infrastructure and electrical.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're trying to, here in the EMP Task Force, we're trying to emphasize that this is a bipartisan concern. This isn't like a partisan wedge issue, and we don't want it to ever come across that way, because if you think about, the danger of a super solar storm is very similar to what liberal Democrats talk about, in terms of climate change. So we actually include that. It's a natural environmental disaster that could occur in the event of climate change, and certainly in the case of an EMP or cyber attack, that could, even a cyber attack could potentially take out our nuclear reactors and cause them to melt down if they don't have, if the power is not restored within a few weeks. Right. So imagine the environmental disaster that would happen from that. And that, that could occur from cyber, EMP, or a super solar storm. So if Democrats truly care about the environment, as I believe they do, should be their number one priority.
It should be, without a doubt. So what a great way to unify people, right? Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Do you have anything else you want to leave us with that you want to add? And of course, tell everybody where to find your articles. And
I just want to thank you for having me on your show. It's shows like this that are so important to educate our citizens about, these clear and present dangers that the media doesn't tell them about, and even some Republicans don't even highlight. So very important. But in terms of what your listeners can do, I'd urge them to go to our website at www.emptaskforce.us. And there you can find a donate button. We are a nonprofit organization. Even though we're a congressionally authorized board, we're a nonprofit. And so we need more funding to finance our efforts to get the word out, to travel back and forth to Washington, D.C. to kind of motivate and incentivize our U.S. senators and members of Congress to pass this critical legislation. As well as, there's a lot of resources. You can there's a volunteer tab on our website that could also, we'd love to have more volunteers. We have more and more state leaders that are kind of being formed with every passing week. And so there may even be a position in our state leadership team for some of your listeners that might be really passionate about making a difference on this issue.
Wonderful.
Save, potentially a couple hundred American lives, a couple hundred million, if this threat materializes.
That would be amazing. Yeah. So hopefully people will get involved, and that would be, we need it. We really need it. So thank you so much for everything you're doing. And thank you so much for sharing this really incredibly valuable information with all of us and for your
Absolutely. Thank you.